My name's David Phinnemore from Queen's University Belfast, and I'm here to talk to you a little bit about Brexit as part of Queen's ongoing public engagement activities around the Brexit process. What I'm doing today replaces one of the cancelled Brexit clinics, which we were hoping to hold this month, and is an initial attempt on our part to use online media to keep everybody up to date with at least our perspectives on where we are with Brexit. We're hoping to run a number of similar events in due course, and we'll be in contact with everybody about those. Okay, as I say, I want to talk about Brexit and where we are. Okay, and you should see now a number of slides which I want to work through with you. Okay, where are we? We're obviously in the midst of the transition process. The UK left the European Union on the 31st of January this year. It's a transition period which is scheduled to last until the 31st of December this year. As part of that transition process, a number of things happening. Importantly, there are negotiations on the post-transition UK-EU relationship. That's to be negotiated during the course of this year and should come into force at the beginning of 2021, assuming we don't have an extension of the transition process. So I want to say a few words about the state of the negotiations. Then we want to focus a little bit on the implementation of the protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland. What's happening there, because there are obviously important decisions that need to be taken during the course of 2020 so that those provisions can come into force at the beginning of 2021, once again, assuming there is no extension to the transition period. And then I want to come to that question of, will there be an extension to the transition period? The COVID-19 situation is obviously putting enormous pressure on those involved in government, diverting attention away from, understandably, the Brexit process. And this has raised questions as to whether the UK and the EU can really endeavour or really achieve what they hope to during the course of 2020 in the current climate. So there's questions being raised about whether there should be an extension to the transition period. Okay, so let's have a look at those negotiations that are taking place between the UK and the EU. Since the UK left the EU at the end of January, both sides, the EU27 and the UK, have published their positions on the future relationship. The EU adopted its negotiating directives back on the 25th of February, and the UK 2 days later published its approach to the negotiations. That then led the way for a first set of negotiations in early March, where I think 100 officials from either side came together to begin to work on a number of different themes in those negotiations, which ultimately should all come together as part of a future arrangement, a future relationship to come into force on the 1st of January next year. Unfortunately, owing to the COVID-19 situation, it wasn't possible to proceed with the second round of negotiations. They were cancelled. And as a consequence, what was a very, very tight timetable, which we'll come to in a moment, looks unlikely to be delivered. Okay. In the meantime, what we have seen published is a European Commission draft text of a UK-EU agreement. This is a weighty document, substantial document, which is in the public domain, and basically sets out the EU's position in terms of what it's hoping to achieve as part of this relationship. Has to be said that if one looks at the negotiating directives of the EU, and one compares those to what the UK has been putting forward in terms of its approach to the negotiations, there's a fair bit of difference in terms of the aspiration, ambition for the future relationship to be concluded this year. I think it's fair to say there are big differences between the UK and the EU on what the level of commitment the UK should have towards things like regulatory alignment, which we've heard about a lot, but also the broader scope of the relationship. to which they're aspiring. Okay. Now, obviously, this is all still to be negotiated, and these are opening positions which the two sides have adopted. And we'll see over the course of the year how those negotiations pan out and what ultimately comes together as a consequence of these negotiations. Now, as I said, there's a very, very tight timetable. The European Commission has published this flow diagram for the negotiations, indicating key elements of it. You see on the left-hand side the preparations of the EU and the European, or the EU 27 member states and the European Parliament, and they produce then their negotiating mandate. We then have in yellow a series of negotiating rounds between the EU and the UK, scheduled originally from March through to the end of May, beginning of June, and then through August into October. In the middle of all that, you're going to get a high-level EU-UK conference at which they'd be reviewing the progress in the negotiation. The plan was that you'd be making sufficient progress there such that you'd have arrangements in broad agreement on a range of different issues. However, it was recognised that you probably need to be thinking about whether you wanted to take up the opportunity to extend that transition period beyond the end of 2020. Okay. The reason for the tight timetable is because, as you see there in sort of the greenish block, whatever is agreed has to be ratified by both the UK and the EU. So negotiations cannot go right up until the end of 2020. They need to be concluded probably in October, so that the European Parliament and the UK Parliament can sign off on or can ratify whatever is agreed between the UK government and the EU 27 with regard to the future relationship. It was always assumed that you wouldn't necessarily be able to cover everything during this negotiation, and therefore there would be some outstanding issues which you'd come to negotiate after the transition period has ended. Okay, so this is the timetable or the schedule for 2020 prior to COVID-19. Clearly, what COVID-19 is doing is raising questions as to whether this exceedingly tight timetable can be met. And as I said, we'll come back in a moment to whether there will be an extension of the transition period before the end of June this year. There's obviously discussions around that at the moment. Okay. The second key issue on the agenda of the UK and the EU is the implementation of the withdrawal agreement. And viewed from Northern Ireland, obviously what's really important here is the implementation on the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, and the various measures in there which are designed to ensure that we do not see a return to a hard border on the island of Ireland. Okay. Important for the implementation is the UK-EU Joint Committee. This is the main decision-making body. That has now met for the first time, 30th of March this year, and as part of that, discussed a range of different issues which need to be addressed. Essentially, it's got 4 sets of key decisions to be taken this year. One relates to goods, those goods which are moving from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, which can be exempted from tariffs on entering Northern Ireland. The goods there, what's important is that they need to be identified as not being at risk of onward movement into the EU if they are to be exempted. There's also questions about fish and other aquaculture products, how those can enter the EU customs union. There's also questions about the level of permissible agricultural subsidies payable to producers in Northern Ireland, so that they can retain their access to the wider EU market. And then fourthly, there's a range of issues to be identified concerning the practical working arrangements for EU officials involved in the implementation of the protocol. UK, under the protocol, will be implementing the Union Customs Code in Northern Ireland, and obviously the EU wants to ensure that that is implemented effectively, and so there needs to be arrangements put in place whereby there can be effective oversight, monitoring by EU officials of the activity of the UK in this respect. Okay. Also flagged on this slide is a really interesting report from the Institute for Government, which is looking at the role of the Joint Committee. Put a link there because it is a very useful piece, just outlining what the UK-EU Joint Committee has to do this year and how it is expected to operate. Okay. Worth reminding ourselves here of the sort of range of questions which need to be addressed as part of the implementation of the protocol as regards the movement of goods between Northern Ireland and the rest of the UK. As we know, the UK will, as part of its withdrawal agreement, be leaving the single market, will be leaving the customs union at the end of this year. And certainly in terms of its approach to the negotiations on the future relationship, is not envisaging being part of a customs union relationship with the EU or signing up to key elements of the single market. Now, with Northern Ireland effectively remaining in the EU customs territory and also abiding by EU rules for the free movement of goods into the single market, there's going to have to be a range of checks on the movement of goods between Great Britain and Northern Ireland. And a key role here for the UK and the EU during the course of this year is to ensure that the necessary formalities, checks and controls are put in place on the movement of goods, particularly from Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Okay. However, there's also got to be issues addressed around the movement of goods and some of the customs and regulatory checks that may be necessary on their movement as far as goods are concerned moving between Northern Ireland and Great Britain. Here, we have a UK government commitment to unfettered access for Northern Ireland producers into the rest of the UK market. The modalities of achieving that, ensuring that, are still to be worked out as well. So that's another issue which needs to be addressed during the course of this year. Okay. Just a few words on the outcome of the Joint Committee that met at the end of last month. You'll see here both an excerpt from the UK readout of that meeting and also a statement from the European Commission. If we first of all look at the UK government readout, you'll see who was involved. Michael Gove on behalf of the UK government and Maros Sefcovic on behalf of the Commission. They're leading for the two sides in the Joint Committee. But importantly there, from Northern Ireland perspective, there was a small delegation of ministers from Northern Ireland Executive participating in the meeting, a meeting which had to be held by teleconference owing to the COVID-19 situation. I think it's fair to say that the European Commission's statement following the meeting is slightly fuller in its analysis of the meeting itself. And I think here it's worth pointing out that there are continued concerns on the part of the EU about the UK government's commitment to the full implementation of the protocol. Concerns exist, and this is reflected, or these are reflected in the statement that we have there from the Commission. You note that both sides now have to implement this agreement with rigour and discipline. And then the underlined section indicating that from the EU perspective that there is an urgent need for a detailed timetable to be presented and the necessary measures introduced for the introduction of customs procedures for goods entering Northern Ireland from Great Britain, and for ensuring that other regulatory checks can be carried out on behalf of the EU by the UK in respect of goods entering Northern Ireland from outside the EU. Okay, so I think it's fair to say that there are concerns there about what progress is being made on the part of the UK for implementing the protocol, but at least the UK-EU Joint Committee is now up and running, and the discussions can take place about that implementation process. So we've got the negotiations on the future relationship underway. We've got the Joint Committee meeting, and the implementation of the protocol, or preparation for the full implementation of the protocol, is underway as well. We can obviously expect further developments on both those issues in the coming months and for the rest of the year. In particular, on the UK-EU negotiations, there's obviously been some difficulties around delivering on those negotiations because of the COVID-19 situation. Both David Frost, the UK's chief negotiator, and Michel Barnier were taken out of circulation because of contracting COVID-19. But as you see from David Frost's tweet from yesterday, contacts are continuing. And both sides are remaining in touch with one another. There's an exchange of legal texts, and there are various conference calls ongoing to explore and clarify various technicalities. Plans are there to ensure that these discussions go ahead, but I think it's fair to say that in the current context and operating remotely, there are very, very significant difficulties in progressing the negotiations that both sides would necessarily want. But nevertheless, clear commitment to ensure that those negotiations continue under the current crisis context. Okay, in terms of implementing the protocol, what we're also seeing coming out of the Joint Committee at the end of last month was the decision to launch 6 specialised committees. From Northern Ireland's perspective, that's important because the specialised committee on the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, will now be established and has been charged with discussing and preparing decisions of the Joint Committee that it has to adopt in relationship to the protocol before the end of the transition period. These are the issues I mentioned earlier around movement of goods, fish, the question of agricultural support, subsidies to producers in Northern Ireland, and the arrangements for EU officials overseeing the implementation of the protocol. Moreover, the specialised committee is there to help prepare the next meeting of the Joint Committee, which for practical reasons is not currently foreseen to be taking place until June. That's likely to be an important meeting, given the discussions that we now turn to around whether the transition period does, in the circumstances, need to be extended. Okay, so extending the transition period. If we think back to the original draft of the withdrawal agreement from 2018, it was envisaged that the transition period could be extended, and originally it was a fairly short extension, a short period in the transition for negotiating the future relationship. It was then decided, okay, you possibly needed an extra 1 or 2 years beyond the original time frame. So Article 132 was included, which allows for the Joint Committee, the UK-EU Joint Committee, before the end of June, so before the 1st of July 2020, to adopt a decision, a single decision, extending the transition period for up to 1 or 2 years. This, given the context in which we find ourselves, is gaining increasing amount of attention, because for a lot of people, not only was the transition period probably too short to achieve the ambition of the two sides to conclude an agreement on the future relationship, but with COVID-19 significantly hampering government activity and also proving difficult for creating a situation where it's difficult to actually proceed with the negotiations effectively, people have actually said, well, we should be looking to whether that opportunity in Article 132 can be taken up and the transition period extended. You'll see there on the right-hand side some findings from a recent poll of people about their attitudes towards extending the transition. To date, British government has been loath to contemplate an extension, but I think it's fair to say that developments in the last month or so, particularly around coronavirus, is increasing a willingness amongst people to contemplate an extension for obvious pragmatic reasons. So I think that there's support there for an extension. Certainly on the EU side, as reported in the Sunday Times last weekend, Commission officials are understood to favour an extension. They're looking for quite a substantial extension, 6 or 12 months, potentially even more. However, on the British government side, at least for the moment, there's the preference is for something much shorter. Whether this will change over time in the coming months is open to question. but I think certainly one of the key decisions which are going to be taken by the Joint Committee in June will be on whether that extension period will be that opportunity to extend the transition will be taken up. I think in all likelihood we will see it being taken up, but what sort of extension will be agreed remains to be seen. Okay, so that concludes my observations for the moment on where we are with Brexit. Hopefully that's been useful. Not a huge amount has happened since we held our previous Brexit clinic in February, but clearly there's still a huge amount of work which needs to be done in terms of negotiating the future relationship, in terms of preparing for the implementation of the protocol on Ireland, Northern Ireland, and that work will continue on those issues between the UK and the EU, obviously under very difficult circumstances at the moment. And there will obviously be this high-level review taking place in June. As I mentioned in the last slide, key issue there is probably going to be extending the transition period, because certainly under the current crisis situation, serious questions must be asked as to whether there is sufficient time to achieve what has to be achieved during the transition period before the end of 2020. So plenty there to be thinking about. We're hopefully going to be coming back to you with a number of other presentations in the coming months to update you on where we think things are with Brexit and some of the challenges this process continues to raise, both for the UK and the EU generally, but also specifically for Northern Ireland.